So you're going to see that today's talk has many, many messages. And the first message I hope is going to be pretty clear as I go through this talk. When you think about energy, when we think about energy, very often we think about our cars and the way to get to a certain place at a certain time. And of course, there's always alternatives like walking, or if you want to get there a little bit faster, running. We do some of that. In February, you can get on your bicycle, but that's not for everyone. And then there's alternatives that we can use. I'm a big fan of these alternatives, which is why I was late today. In Montreal, using the alternatives is not always obvious. Then you run into problems immediately if your mother lives, or your parents, or your girlfriend lives in the suburbs, and you have to get onto a train, or you have to get onto a, yes, it's horrible, or on one of these commuter buses. But still, it's doable. Of course, most of us use a car, and I got this picture. And believe it or not, I got it off the web, and it actually says Autorité de Carré Congestion, which is par for the course. So this is a bit of a headache. A better alternative is to use a smaller car. And then you have these things that are started appearing a little bit in Montreal, but these are in California, they're widespread. They're everywhere, alternative energy cars or electrical cars. Now, if you actually look at the statistics, this mode of transportation is really the most common one that's out there. About 83% of all Canadian households own at least one car. And many of these households own actually 2 or 3 cars. So you can see how central cars are to our society and how important it is to have cars for society to function. Just to give you some numbers, and these are actually old numbers, it's probably a little bit higher now, but what they call the motor vehicle fleet, so the collection of all the cars in Canada, if you inventory them, in 2007 was divided between 19 million light cars or light trucks or vans, and collectively they drove 300 billion kilometers, and then 700,000 heavy trucks. These are the trucks you see on the Metropolitan all the time going back and forth, which collectively account for about 32 billion kilometers. The thing that's really not shown in these statistics is that these trucks here consume a lot more energy than the cars. So you have 10 times more kilometers driven by the cars for a lot less, about 20 times less trucks, and then they consume, of course, a lot more energy. This is a statistic that really bothers me, and I'll talk more about it in the future and later in the conference. But for people that work outside the home, and this is most of us take our cars to go to work. And if you think about going to work, usually it's this little trip that's not very far, across town, down the street, on the other side of the bridge or something like that. So we're talking about very, very low amounts of mileage. Now, when you start thinking about electric cars, because the limitation of electric cars usually is the distance it can travel on a full charge of a battery, this is very easily achievable. So the point here is that we rely a lot on cars, but there's alternatives to doing this, and walking and running and everything else is an important thing to do. And then eventually, hopefully, we're going to get to electric cars or alternative modes of transportation for you and me. Now, if you actually look at the numbers more closely, there's always energy consumption or fuel consumption. But if you actually look at the amount of greenhouse gas emissions, in 2007, again, this is the earliest statistics I could find, the transportation sector, so trucks, cars, buses, and everything else, were responsible for about 26% of all the greenhouse gases that were put out there. So, I mean, you start putting these numbers through your head and you realize that at 26%, a good proportion of this is actually probably produced by these guys here, right? These big trucks that are spewing a lot of greenhouse gas and consuming a lot of fuels. And it's only 26%, which is still significant, but then you think about if we all start getting out of our cars and using electric cars, we still have this left behind, which probably accounts for a large percentage of that percentage. And that percentage is overall is still pretty small. Where's all the other 80-something percent, or 70-something percent coming from? And this illustrates that very well. So if you look at the greenhouse gas emissions in I believe this was in Canada, you can see they're separated here in years. So you can see that that's actually going up. This is in metric ton of carbon dioxide equivalent. And so you can see that the greenhouse gas emissions are going up through time. But you can also see that a good proportion of these greenhouse gas emissions are not from the transportation sector, okay? Or if they're from the transportation sector, they're not from road transportation, but another source of transportation. So that up here, on-road emissions, the amount of cars that you and I drive are probably very small up here. So everyone thinks that if you leave your car at home, you can solve the environmental problems and you can reduce all the greenhouse gas emissions. That's not necessarily true. Now, I'm not discouraging you to take your bicycle or take the public transit, but you can see that if you actually start looking at the numbers and looking to see where the energy is going from to and where the greenhouse gas is coming from, you see that the cars that we drive every day is actually not that much of a big, it is a big percentage, but it's not the biggest percentage of the contribution. So then you have to think about these things here. And this is the thing that you and I don't see every day, and we hardly ever think about, right? So think about the bicycle you ride to work every day. So you're riding a bicycle and you think you're doing good for the environment, but that bicycle, the environmental footprint of that bicycle can be huge, okay? And it's something that you don't see. Same thing for that kiwi that you eat at breakfast every morning. The kiwi's coming from New Zealand, right? You think you're eating healthy, but are you really eating healthy? You know, would you be better off eating an apple that's coming from across the bridge? And that's mostly because of all of this, right? So your kiwi is going to be coming off a plane or a big boat. These guys, in terms of energy consumption and greenhouse gas emissions, can account for many trips every day, every year. So that at the end of the day, you might be better off to take your car to go to the grocery store and buy apples, and in terms of environmental benefits, it'd be almost equivalent. Now, the number of these trips, and this is interesting, there's a picture that I have here. This demonstrates, we always think about where we live in our little neighborhood trips and everything, and going to the store and back and forth. But what this map represents is really the global transportation sector, and it's hard to see on the map here. It's actually shown at the bottom. So and there's light pink lines that are going across all the continents and the countries, and these dark red lines that are going in between continents. These are the shipping lanes for trucks and trains and boats and big transportation boats. These things have a huge environmental impact, okay? Huge. Something that's really hard to account for, mostly because it's international. And the number of trips and the amount of gasoline and energy that these things are consuming is quite significant. So the point I'm trying to make here is that cheap transportation is central to society and the economy, and that's not necessarily your cheap transportation to your car driving to work back and forth, but cheap transportation in terms of being able to move things from across the globe. If you think about this global economy, we have to move things all over the place. There was something on television yesterday. There's a book that was put out recently by, I forget the author, called A Book About Stuff or something like that. And it talks about, the example that they gave on the news last night was talking about an iPod that you buy and all the different parts and components and where they come from. You know, the packaging might be coming from somewhere in Indonesia. The metals to make the iPod might be coming from Africa. The iPod was actually assembled in China. They're all put in ships and they're all moved to the USA. So you buy that little iPod that's about this big, you use it for a year, you throw it in the garbage, but the environmental footprint of that iPod is huge, okay? And for that iPod to cost you $200, cheap transportation is central, okay? And we saw that right away when the price of gasoline in about a year ago went up through the roof, and all of a sudden buying a banana almost doubled at the grocery store. That's what the impact was. It was cheap transportation. So the world is hungry for energy, and these numbers are really interesting. So we're actually sitting over here. So this was a prediction that was made in 2007 or so. We're actually sitting over here. So what you're looking at here is years, and past this line here is predictions, and going up is the amount of energy that we're going to need in metric ton. Now, the top three lines, you're looking at oil, coal, and gas, okay? Gas is natural gas. One of the reasons why, so first of all, you can see that this is actually accelerating and not slowing down, right? So, and this is, next graph is going to show you something a little bit different. Everyone thinks that our energy consumption is slowing down. It might be slowing down in the developed countries in North America and Europe, but it's certainly not going down in a lot of other countries across the globe. And as a matter of fact, the use of coal is going up rapidly, and this is mostly because a lot of the developing countries, or the rapidly developing countries, I should say, like India and China, are producing a lot of their energy using coal. So the use of coal is going through the roof. And then you can see things like hydro, which is what Quebec relies a lot on, is a really, really small portion, and there's not a lot of increases or predicted increases in the use of hydro over years. So really what we want to do is we want to actually take all of these things down and take all of these things up. Okay? And what the talk is eventually leading to is how do we actually do this, and how can biotechnology contribute to that? So this is the slide that I was mentioning before. So the change in oil demand, and these are predictions up to 2003, you can see that the countries that are part of this Organization for Economic Development, OECD, so that's mostly, so if you look at OECD in North America, it's the US and Canada, and in Europe, it's all the Italy and France and Germany and all these countries. You can actually see that the oil demand is actually going to drop, right? So we feel as a society here that we're doing fairly well because we're using our energy better, we're conserving better, we're insulating our houses better, the efficiency of the cars that we're driving around is better, we're finding alternatives. So as a whole, we're predicting that our demand for oil is going to go down, but if you actually look at the rest of the map, this demand for energy is actually going to go through the roof, and especially oil. And this is mostly because we, in Europe and North America, and some places in the Pacific, have actually gone through our industrial revolution in the 70s, and a lot of other countries are going through the industrial revolution now. Right? So, and this is always a dilemma where all the big countries sitting around, they start talking about carbon emission and greenhouse gas emissions, and they're going, well, you countries over here, you have to slow down your emissions just like we are. And it's always a question of fairness. Is this fair, right? The other countries are going to say, well, you've gone through industrial revolutions. Why aren't we allowed to do it ourselves and build up our manufactories and cities and economy and really drag our countries out of poverty just like you did? So in a sense, the way you might want to look at this is if we can reduce ours as much as possible so we can offset some of the greenhouse gases that are coming from the other countries, then we're actually doing our part. But to be asking these countries to reduce their emissions is borderline, I wouldn't say unethical, but it's difficult to do. Everyone talks about peak oil. I wanted to show this graph because, so this is a prediction, and there's a lot of people out there that make predictions about how much oil do we actually have, right? And that's a tough calculation. How much oil do we have and how long is it going to last? And it's a tough calculation to make because you have to make predictions as to how much oil is left undiscovered out there. But you can actually do these, and these models have shown to be fairly accurate in that you can use the past to predict the future a little bit. And you can see that in the last 10 years or so, our rate at which we discover new oil has been dropping rapidly, and our consumption of oil has been growing rapidly. And there are places where we've stopped discovering new oil. We don't discover new oil in the USA anymore. We don't discover new oil in Europe. So what's over there, we know what it is, and how fast we're consuming it, we know what it is. So you can actually see that this concept of peak oil, in some countries, the USA reached their maximum peak production of oil in the 1970s. They're a huge net importer of oil. They're not discovering new oil, and the oil that they have left, they're up in Alaska and some strange places like that in the Gulf of Mexico. Europe, according to these figures, have also reached their peak oil. What are these countries here? Russia, oh, that's kind of hard to predict. They're still discovering new oil. And we fall into the others somewhere, which is this bluish stuff here. Now, according to the numbers that are out there, we actually, I don't know how much of this amount of oil we own here in Canada, but between Canada and the Middle East, we actually own, and Russia, we actually own a lot of the oil. But the point I'm trying to make here is that irrespective of where you kind of move these numbers around, let's say you've made a few mistakes in your assumptions, well, your peak oil might be in 2020, or maybe your peak oil was in 1970. Does it really matter, right? If we missed it by 20 years, 30 years, I might be dead, but you guys are going to be around. And it really doesn't matter if your peak oil is 10 years from now or 30 years from now. It's very close, okay? So you can see that at one point, and very near in the future, the amount of oil is going to be very, very low. So really what I'm saying here is that supply is going down, right? And the other thing, too, that people don't realize is that the oil that we're pulling out of the ground over here and the oil that we're pulling out of the ground here is two different kinds of oils. So to pull this oil out of the ground is a lot more expensive than to pull this oil out of the ground. You always go for the easiest stuff first, right? So the perfect example is the tar sands in Alberta. The tar sands up to about 5 to 10 years ago weren't even touched because that oil just wasn't worth extracting. It was too expensive, it was too dirty, the technology wasn't there. But now that we're sitting at $70 a barrel, that oil becomes interesting, so we go after it. And it's going to be like that the further we move on. We've gotten all the cheap and easy oil, the light crude as they call it, and now we're going after the more difficult stuff. Now, anyone that's taken a microeconomics class knows the theory of supply and demand. So here's your supply, and here's your demand, okay? So you can just put the 2 and 2 together and you realize that no matter what we do, this is almost impossible to control on a global scale, and this is very much impossible to control, okay? And in a sense, oil and energy cannot follow the law of supply and demand because we can't control supply. Supply is an already predetermined finite amount of stuff out there. So normally what happens as the demand increases, we increase the supply. We can't increase the supply of oil. That just doesn't happen. So the net effect is the prices go up and up and up and up because the supply outgrows the demand outgrows the supply. So the question really is not whenever you're going to run out of oil, because in a sense we'll never run out of oil. If you actually stretch this out, it's going to go a long time. Okay? So the question is not when are we going to run out of oil. The question is when are we going to run out of cheap oil? That it really is the question. Are you going to be willing to fuel your car up at $300 a liter 10 years from now? Right? So you laugh, but is this where we're heading? Okay? It's not how much do we have, are we going to run out of it, is how much are you willing to pay for it? Okay? And the perfect example again comes back to the price of food that's been increasing drastically in the past 2-3 years. That's exactly why. Okay? The price of oil is going through the roof right now, mostly because of the big demands in the Asian countries, and then everything is affected, right? From the price of your iPod to the price of your bananas. So the solution, and this is why I was kind of mentioning all the slides up to now, because we're going to get into the biotechnology in a minute, but the one that I'm a proponent of, so I work down here, but I always say work here first, right? Conserve first, that's the simplest solution, and increase your efficiency. This is an interesting thing. In a combustion engine in the car, when you burn gasoline, most of your energy is actually lost through heat and not through propelling the car forward. So if you can actually make a more efficient car where you actually use all of your energy as opposed to wasting most of it, then you're making quite a dent in your energy consumption. Serious changes in lifestyle, and that's going to be by choices or necessity, okay? And this was interesting when we were going through this 2 years ago when the price of gas was $1.40 at the pump, $1.40 or so a liter, dollars per liter. People were actually noticing that there was a significant reduction in traffic coming across the bridges in the highway, okay? So that's the pressure point. And I've always said the price of oil and gasoline should always be at that pressure point, okay? Everyone's going to be able to spend that much money on gasoline for a liter up to a certain point. And after that certain point, then they start changing their lifestyle. So in my opinion, gas should always be at that price. And what's going to happen is that people are going to make decisions as to when and why they should drive their cars. So you can still use your cars for the things that are really important, but eventually you're going to realize that once in a while you should leave your car at home for things that are not so important, or you shouldn't make that trip, 5 trips a day to get milk and cigarettes or whatever. You make that 1 trip a day. So your lifestyle is really not affected. It's small decisions that you're forced to make because it's costing you too much to buy that gasoline. When gasoline is really cheap, people don't think about that. So that's why you have to force them to think a little bit wiser. Of course, technology development is going to have a lot to do with this because it's pretty obvious, hopefully for you by now, that we're not going to get away from oil and we're not going to get away from fuels. We need it. We're always going to need it now, today, tomorrow, 100 years from now. So the question is, if you combine this, and that, do we have a solution? Okay? I can't do much about this or that myself, or I can do something about it myself, but I can't force other people to do anything. So I've decided to spend a lot of the time in my research in my laboratory addressing some of these things. So now the title. And I've actually added a word, I think. Modern. That wasn't the original title I sent, but is modern biotechnology the solution to clean and sustainable biofuel? And I added modern because, so when I started writing the definition of biotechnology, I realized that there's modern and older biotechnology. So if you just look at the definition of technology, it's really the using knowledge, tools, and crafts for a specific purpose, right? So you have high technology, which is computers, and then you have biotechnology, which is technology based on biology. And I'm just listing some applications here. You've probably heard about this quite a bit in the news about the GMOs. You've probably talked about this at Marianopolis. So this would be an obvious use of biotechnology. You're taking crops like corn, and you're going in there and you're playing around with the genetics, and you're making a better crop of corn for whatever purpose you want. So that's what they call agricultural biotechnology. In the health, which is probably the biggest part of biotechnology, then there's unlimited amount of research and applications, from developing new pharmaceuticals to developing new diagnostics and things like that. In environment, there's something called bioremediation. It's really using microorganisms to clean up soils, to clean up polluted waters, et cetera, et cetera. In industry, there's something called white biotechnology, or sometimes called green biotechnology. And this is mostly where I operate and where the rest of the talk is going to be. It's how can you actually apply technology to things like making chemicals, fuels, and polymers in a much more greener, environmentally friendly way. So how does that work? First, I'll give you a bit of a snapshot, because to understand what we can do in biotechnology today, we have to understand how far we've gone and where we've come from. And every time I show some of these slides, including my parents, they always get blown away by these numbers. Sequencing DNA, okay? This whole thing started in 1993. And when they started the Human Genome Sequencing Project, they estimated that it would cost $3.4 billion and 13 years, okay, to sequence the entire genome. And that's almost what it cost. But what actually happened is that the technology to sequence, and this represents the amount of dollar that it costs to sequence a base pair over the years, right? So I'm not going to go into the discussion of what DNA is, but hopefully you've covered that in some of your courses. Did they? Yeah? Okay. So to sequence a base pair was a lot of money back then, but they've developed a lot of technology where we're actually sitting down here, okay? So to sequence your genome today would cost about $150,000, probably a little bit less now actually, and it would take a few weeks, as opposed to $3.4 billion in 13 years. And we're only talking about 20 years ago, okay? So the leap in the technology and what we can do now in biotechnology is significantly improved. I mean, I say here soon we should be able to do this at 10,000, and the goal, the National Institute of Health in the United States has a $1,000 genome goal. And believe it or not, some of the hospitals in Montreal have started equipping themselves with genome sequencers. They're still at the beginning of it, but there's going to be a day, and it's not that far off, where you're going to walk in a hospital, they're going to take a blood sample, and 2 days later they're going to have your genome sequenced. And they're probably going to hand you that in a little chip, and they're going to say, here's your medical record, you carry that with you. It's much closer than you think. As I said, the hospitals have these instruments in their clinics right now. They're just not sure how to use it yet. And then you can think of all the ethical problems that come with that. But we're not going to deal with that today. Okay? So your genome has 3.4 billion base pairs and contains somewhere between 20 and 25,000 genes. So it's a lot of genes. E. coli is a little bit smaller. We can actually do E. coli. We do a lot of this stuff in my lab. We'll send some yeast or some E. coli to get sequenced, and about a week later we have the entire sequence. We can do that much faster because it has less chromosomes and the genomes are smaller. But it's a fairly easy, simple thing to do today. So this is my analogy, right? So now we have fast and cheap methods to identify the genes. And I always say, think of them as Legos. Okay? Each gene is a piece of Lego. And so there'd be something like 20 to 25,000 pieces of Lego here. And that's really the parts. You probably heard that analogy before. It's the parts to put together a living organism. It becomes more complicated. If it was that simple, right, anybody could do this. The problem is that you can assemble all these Legos and in the end up with a whole huge diversity of living organisms. So obviously which genes are put together and how these genes function together really influences the outcome, okay, in a big way. Or else we'd all look the same in this room, and that'd be pretty boring. So what do we do with these genes, and what do we know about these genes? So there's a central dogma of biology where you have your DNA that's replicated and makes a piece of RNA which ends up in a protein. And it's an interaction between these three different things that makes a living organism what it is. So this is also something that always blows people away. We've actually developed things called gene chips, and we actually have better technology now. So I can take all 20 to 25,000 of your genes and put it on a little chip, okay? And at any given time, I can take a blood sample and tell you which genes are expressed and which genes are not expressed, okay? So now I'm one step closer. First, I identify all the pieces of the puzzle, and now I'm a second step closer. I can tell you which pieces you're using and which pieces you're not using. And I can go even farther than that. If I take a little bit of tissue from your liver or a little bit of tissue from your brain, I can tell you which genes are turned on in your brain, which genes are turned on in your liver. at any given time, okay? So you're that much closer to that, and this is fairly simple stuff that's actually been around for probably a good 10 years or so in the biotech labs. Then we've gone even farther, okay? So this is your genes that are expressed. So here's your genes. Your genes are expressed into a messenger RNA, and then you can tell which messenger RNAs are turned on by these gene chips. And the messenger RNA are translated into proteins, and you can now go down there and actually evaluate and analyze which proteins are actually expressed in your system, in your cells or in your organs. So now you're starting to get a map, right? What are the pieces? Which pieces are turned down, and which ones are turned up or down, and which ones produce proteins? Now, this has led to something called systems biology, which is really, 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 really complicated. I don't even understand most of it most of the time. But what you're not supposed to kind of really understand what this means, but each one of these things would represent a protein or a gene, okay? And in here you have, what do you have? The nucleus, the cytoplasm, the extracellular milieu, the plasma membrane. So some of these genes or proteins are expressed in different parts of the cell, okay? And what this is trying to illustrate is that each of these genes and these proteins are interacting, okay? So this map is trying to illustrate which gene and which protein is interacting with which gene and which protein. And you can immediately see that in any given cell, there's going to be some certain number of genes that are very central, that influences a lot of things. And then you can have genes that are kind of sitting out there that don't seem to influence too many things or interact with a lot of other genes or proteins. So you can easily imagine, let's say in disease, if you get a mutation in here, you might be in big trouble. If you get a mutation in there, not so bad. But this is really, really complicated. So you have the pieces of the puzzle, how much of them are being used or being expressed in your cells, and then how many proteins are being made, and then a map of how things interact with each other, okay? So, so the point I'm really trying to make here is we're at the point where we've deciphered enough of the biology, because really what we've been trying to do in the last hundreds of years is trying to understand how does it work? You know, what are the players, what are the genes, which ones are turned down, how are organs formed, and how are branches developed on a tree, and that's what we've been trying to learn over the years, right? What I'm going to keep talking to you about here is that we've actually reached a stage now where we've learned enough about biological systems and genetics that we can start tinkering with it, okay? If I understand which are all the parts, I understand more or less how the parts come together and what the parts do, can I now go into the lab and select some parts, put them together, and build something biological, okay? Now, you're all thinking Frankenstein's in your head, but that's not where we're at right now. And I'll give you some examples how we can do this in biotechnology to develop fuels in a sustainable way, clean and sustainable way. Of course, there's millions of applications on how you can do this and what you can do with that. There's actually a competition. This is really neat. You all have computers, and you can Google IGEM, International Genetic Engineer Machine, okay? There's an international competition every year that's held at MIT, and every university, or a lot of universities on the planet, have teams, and they actually have to design and build genetic machines. So you probably heard the robotics competition. A lot of universities have, or the bridge building competition. So now they have the equivalent for a living organism building competition called IGEM, okay? So it started quite a few years back, but it's quite crazy. And it's a little bit like the robotics. My niece participates in those things, and I always give you a task. Your robot has to go over there, pick up this ball, and move it over here and drop it in this basket, right? So that's the task. So in the case of the IGEM competition, they'll say, well, your bacteria has to swim across the plate and then turn green. You know, and so they can do that, actually. They can actually genetically engineer these things to respond to cues and signals and do things like that. It's really the early steps, but it demonstrates how well we can manipulate genetics and get cells to do what we want them to do now, as opposed to having a mind of their own. So what does that have to do with clean and sustainable fuels? So here's a picture, a demonstration of what the state of the technology is today. And this is what you hear about all the time in the news. Biofuels are bad. Biofuels are not sustainable. Biofuels are horrible for the environment. You see that all the time, all over the place. And I'll be the first one to agree that today's version of biofuels is not a good idea, okay? And we need to do better, and we need to improve on this. And this is why there's a lot of research in that direction. So the way it works today, and if you're ever interested, right across the bridge over here in Varennes, there's a plant that does this. It collects corn and actually converts corn to ethanol. So the process is pretty simple. You get these big, huge trucks of corn that shows up to their plant. They grind it up. They mash it and they throw some enzymes in there to liquefy the starch. So what you're trying to get, what's in here is starch, really, right? You heard the term cornstarch, right? So you want to get the starch out, which is a whole bunch of glucose attached one onto the other. So you get the starch out, you get the enzymes. The enzymes will take the starch and break it down to glucose. And then you toss in some yeast the same way that you make beer, wine, bread, all of these things. You toss in some yeast, and the yeast will convert the glucose into alcohol, and then voila, you have alcohol, okay? Now, everyone knows what the problem is with this, right? This should be a food, not a fuel, right? That seems pretty logical. So they have this thing you hear, fuel versus food debate. Why are we taking our food and making fuel out of it? We should be making food out of it. So that actually makes a lot of sense to me. I'd rather eat tortillas than drive a car around. So the idea here is pretty simple. And it's always a question of, and this is where the debate always is at the end you take your ethanol and then you burn in your car and you produce some CO2. But the CO2, I think, that's farther down on my slides. Oh, I can actually see it up here. Can you guys see arrows? Yeah, you can kind of see the arrows. So when you burn the alcohol, there's an arrow that kind of goes over here. The CO2 goes up in the atmosphere, but the plants will fix the CO2. So really here what you're talking about is no net production of CO2 in the environment because you fix it into corn, you burn into your car, and that CO2 goes around and around and around and around. Whereas opposed to if you take oil out of the ground and you burn it, you're taking CO2 that's in the ground, you're putting it in the atmosphere, and you're not returning it in the ground. So this is really the logic behind biofuels. And that's why they say it's sustainable and clean, because you could do this forever without any net input of carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. Okay? Now the problems with this way of making biofuels, there's many problems with them. So they always talk about energy yield. So how much energy does it take you to make so much energy in ethanol? So if it costs me 10 units of energy to grow the corn, but I only get 5 units of energy out of the ethanol, that's not smart, right? You're actually losing energy out of that. You're not gaining energy out of that. So it's the energy yield or the energy output. The carbon dioxide balance, right? So in this case here, you're pretty much carbon dioxide neutral. The problem with the corn, of course, is in terms of energy yields, it's really, really minimal. It's almost a 1-to-1, okay? So the corn ethanol people say, well, hey, we're not losing energy. And the environmentally friendly people say, well, you should be making 10-to-1, not 1-to-1. There's no net gain here, right? We're using as much energy as we're consuming. So there's a net gain in terms of releasing CO2 in the atmosphere, but in terms of energy, there's very little there. There's a question of cost and availability. It was really interesting. When the price of food was going up, the price of corn was going up about a year ago. And it actually reached that point where it was too expensive to buy corn to make ethanol, so the corn plants stopped operating. And at the same time that the price of corn was going up, the price of ethanol was going down. So the energy balance and the money that you can make on corn ethanol is so tight that you should have a little price increase in corn, and then ethanol is not cost affordable anymore. So they're really, really operating right on the edge of return in terms of energy and money. The other problem, too, that's with ethanol, and this is really interesting, and people don't realize that. So the ethanol has really low energy density. In other words, if I put, and this was on television not too long ago either, if I put a tank of ethanol into a car and I put a tank of gasoline into the same car and I start driving the two cars together, the one with the gasoline is going to go much farther than the one with ethanol, okay? So, and the other analogy is that if you were to fly a plane on ethanol, you need wings so huge to hold the ethanol that it just doesn't work, okay? So it's a combustible fuel, but in terms of energy density, it has limitations. You couldn't drive your trains, your big trucks on diesels, your planes, or any of these things on ethanol. On your cars, maybe. The other problem is corrosive. This is why you can only put 5 or 10% in your car. It'll actually rot your engine in your car, okay? Now, they've developed newer technology that they use in Brazil because they produce a lot of ethanol there, but it's corrosive. It's hygroscopic. Hygroscopic means it absorbs water, okay? So that if you leave ethanol sitting around, it actually will take water, and water doesn't burn really well. So that's another problem that you have with ethanol. And at the bottom here it says expensive to purify. The major problem here is that or one of the major problems is that the place where you're going to produce ethanol is going to be where your corn is, and where your corn is not always going to be where you're going to use the ethanol, right? So now you're either moving corn around or you're moving ethanol around. And to move ethanol around, you're consuming as much ethanol moving ethanol around than you're actually using. So it doesn't make any sense. You know, there's no net energy gain. The reason why we can get away with this for oil is because we have these huge pipelines, right? So there's actually a huge pipeline that comes right outside of Montreal here that goes to the refineries, and it keeps going to the coast, and it's coming from Alberta. So there's no trucks going around. There's just big, huge tubes in the ground with some pumps. We don't have the equivalent for ethanol, okay? And we can't move ethanol that way. So in terms of distribution, it's a big problem. So hopefully you can see that I'm not a big fan of some of these technologies. So the idea here is when you're doing these things, and I'm going to start talking to you about alternatives to corn ethanol, right? Other things that we can do. So really what you want to do is you want to take solar energy and you want to take carbon dioxide that's in the atmosphere and you want to turn that into a fuel, right? Stop using food and stop digging holes into the ground. That's really what you want to do. So it's pretty simple. Here's sunlight shining on a tree, and the tree produces biomass and it absorbs carbon dioxide. You can actually take that tree, which is organic matter and oxygen, and break it down and convert the organic matter into a fuel. So it's a simple concept on paper. Okay? So why use cornstarch as opposed to other parts of the plant or another plant altogether? And why make ethanol, for that matter, right? And hopefully by the time I'm done, I only have about 10 more slides, but hopefully by the time I'm done, you're going to realize that ethanol is not such a smart thing to do, and using corn is definitely not a good thing to do either. And we're doing a lot of work to try to get around that problem. So hopefully you've covered this in your biology classes, but this basically depicts how a plant, or what a plant is composed of. So if you actually take a plant, any plant for that matter, and you take the plant cell and you start breaking it down, you're going to see that the components are mostly something called lignin, and lignin is what holds the plant up. If you take the lignin out, the plant kind of falls. That's what gives it this rigidity or solidity. And there's something called hemicellulose, and there's something called cellulose, okay? If you look at hemicellulose, so there's a picture here, and if you look at cellulose, all these things is sugar, okay? So if you remember photosynthesis, what you're actually doing is you're fixing carbon dioxide and you're making sugar, and the plant's converting the sugar into cellulose and hemicellulose, okay? So, and if I was to show you a little kernel of a corn over here, then you'd probably have another drawing here, and it'd say starch. And starch is also chains of glucose, but it's a different kind of chain of glucose, which is why people went after the starch to begin with. The problem here is, so you can easily envision the extrapolate from the starch story, and you can say, well, why can't we take this cellulose, right, and degrade that and ferment that and make alcohol or ethanol or fuel? So in principle, that should be easy, right? But in reality, it's really tough. And the reason is this plant material evolved over millions of years to resist exactly what we're trying to do with it, right? It's actually evolved to be hard to break down and degrade. And what we're trying to do is break it down, degrade it, and make fuel out of it. So we're up against a pretty significant problem where we need to take that plant material, break it down to its single unit sugar molecules, and then ferment that. And the plant doesn't want to do that. I'm going to skip this because it gets a little complicated. I'll just mention it rapidly. So if you actually look, we were talking about corn ethanol. And this represents a % change in greenhouse gas emissions. So these are done using these things called life cycle analysis. So when you do a life cycle analysis, you look at all the carbon dioxide that you're consuming and all the carbon dioxide that you're producing, and then from what they call from wheel to well for the fuel, but it's from field to wheel for the cars. So you can say, I'll give you an example. The farmer's driving his tractor down to collect the corn. That's using energy, and that's producing carbon dioxide. He's putting fertilizer in the field. The fertilizer, to make the fertilizer, you had to use a lot of natural gas, and you had to make a lot of pollution, So that is counted into life cycle assessment. So you take all of these things together, and at the end you say, I have a net output or a net reduction in greenhouse gas emissions. And you can calculate all this. It's pretty complicated calculations. It's all models. What this figure is trying to show is that depending on what your assumptions are and how efficient your tractor is or whatever, your amount of carbon dioxide that you're going to generate or consume is going to change for corn. Irrespective of the model, cellulose ethanol always comes out way on top, okay? So no matter what you do, you're always going to be much better off if you use cellulose than if you use starch. That's pretty much what I wanted to show you with this slide. In the UK, they use beet sugar. In the prairies, they actually use starch from wheat as opposed to starch from corn. And if you go to Brazil, they use sugarcane as a source of carbon to make this. So the sugar cane is actually not such a bad thing to use. And you can see the dot represents the average, and then this is the error within the study. So you can see that depending on what your assumptions are, you can have a lot of errors in your study. But my take-home message to here is really cellulose, no matter how you look at it, is a better source of material to use. Now, ethanol from cellulose is just the first step, really. So there's something called a biorefinery, and the next slide is going to show a little bit better. Everyone thinks of these refineries. You go in there and you extract the oil out of the ground and you refine it. If you've driven through east of Montreal and you smell that, although it's not as bad anymore. What comes out, there's a fuel to drive your cars, but there's all sorts of other stuff that's coming out of there, from polymers to fertilizers to plastics to rubber to clothing material, paints, adhesives, cosmetics. I mean, a lot of the stuff that's around you is actually based from petroleum, okay? So the question now is that instead of just thinking about fuel and driving your car on this stuff, can you think of cellulose as a source of making all of these things? And I'll pop this up all the way through. So this is a concept called the biorefinery, which is really evolving. So that we've in the last 30 years or so, 40 years, we've gone through the petroleum economy, where we actually learned to dig holes into the ground and convert that stuff through chemistry, through all different things. Now we're talking about the bioeconomy and using biorefineries, which are more sustainable, environmentally friendly. So can you, instead of showing you the refinery that's in that previous slide, can you build another kind of refinery? But in this case, you build it close to a source of biomaterial, biomass. And then you can take things like forestry residues, which we have a lot of in Canada, agricultural residues, which we have a lot of in the prairies. So we're not talking about using the corn here. We're talking about using the stalk, using the leftover of the plant that we don't eat, that normally goes back into the ground. And then there's things called short rotation crops that people are trying to develop, or energy crops. You put this through your refinery. At the end, you get commodity chemicals, you get polymers, you get fuels. So if you start thinking about this, it's a lot more environmentally friendly, right? So you're growing CO2, and you're consuming CO2, and you have a closed-loop cycle, as opposed to the refinery before. So that's really the concept of what we're trying to achieve. And this is something we can do, okay? The problem is, I can take a piece of wood, and this is I'm going to explain that in a minute, but I can take a piece of, today, in my lab, we do this. I can take a piece of wood, and I can make alcohol out of it fairly easily, okay? So really, the technology is there. The problem is, if you actually look at the economics, it costs me about $2.40 a liter to make that alcohol, okay? So we know how to do it. We don't know how to make it cheap enough so that we can compete with the fuels and the plastics and everything else that's made from the petrochemical. So that's what we're working on. We need to make the process more efficient and cheaper. To give you an idea how this works, you have wood that comes into the lab, and we have systems that actually does something called pre-treatment, okay? And what really all it is you take that wood, you put in this vessel that's really, really high pressure with some steam, and then you let it cook in there for a little while, and then when it comes out, it actually looks like this. So it's kind of this fuzzy, kind of powdery kind of looking thing, right? So all you're doing there is you're breaking really the structure part of the wood to make the fibers come out. Then we throw enzymes in there, and what the enzymes do is they take the long chains of glucose that makes up the cellulose, or the long chains of xylose that makes the pentoses, and it really breaks it down into sugars, monomeric sugars, glucose and xylose that can be used to be fermented. Then you take this whole mess, you throw it in a reactor or a flask, and you toss in some yeasts, okay? So then you do a fermentation. And your yeast will actually take the glucose that's in here, and it's going to turn it to ethanol. And in the end, you have a distillation. It's off the... And at the end, you have a distillation, you end up with a bottle of ethanol, okay? This, very simple to do, okay? Almost impossible to do in a cost-efficient way. So we just have to find a way to do it cheaper, better, and faster. And this is where really biotechnology comes in. Some of these slides are a little complicated. See now. Okay, so this is a process illustrated in a different way. Here's your cellulose material coming in. I told you about the pre-treatment, this big steam reactor. Then we hydrolyze the cellulose to make the simple sugars. We ferment it, and then we separate it. So you can see it's pretty complicated. There's going to be 1, 2, 3, 4 steps, okay? And you're going to need a lot of different things that go in there. Yeast, that goes in here for the fermentation. Yeah, we actually use a fungi to make the enzyme for the hydrolysis. So you need a fungi fermentation, purify the enzymes. So if you actually start looking at all of this, and people have done this over and over and over again, you can actually cost estimate where all the different costs are coming from for producing this. And this really breaks it down to the cost of each of the steps when you're making a USDA, United States dollar per gallon of fuel. And you can see that's the major costs. So, and this is the one that's becoming more and more interesting. So the capital cost, building your big plant somewhere that's going to do this, right? If you build a corn ethanol producing plant, the one in Varennes over here was about $50 million. To build one of these things is going to be about $400 million, $400 to $600 million, okay? And if you've developed technology to sell your gasoline at $1.60 a liter or something like that, it's going to take you over 10 years to make your money back. So there's not one guy with $400 million in his pocket that would ever invest in that. Okay, if I tell you, give me $400, I'll pay you back in 20 years. You know, it's just not going to happen. So this is one of the major problems. And the reason why building a plant is so expensive is because this whole process is still too complicated, right? The corn ethanol, there's a big tank, and there's a guy that tosses that in there, and it comes out at the other end, and you're done. Here, there's all the different steps. And there's all the different steps mostly because the cellulosic material is really hard to break down and get at, whereas starch is really easy and simple. So the process is just too complicated, and it's too expensive to do. So really what you want to go after is all the different steps in terms of developing technology, all the different steps that makes the plant so complicated and makes it so expensive to build. That's really what you want to address. I'm going to skip that because that's even more complicated. So when we do this, we go look at nature, and we realize that nature has actually figured out how to degrade cellulose. And nature's figured out how to degrade cellulose and turn it into something else, right? So I've always said, if we didn't have all the fungi that actually degrade the cellulose, Montreal would be under 600 feet of wood, right? We need to have a way to degrade the cellulose, and through the natural cycle, carbon cycle on the planet, wood gets degraded, and it gets degraded at a fairly high rate. The other perfect example is cows. Cows eat straw, right? If you and I eat straw, I can tell you it's going to come out the other end untouched. I've never tried it, but I know it's going to come out the other end untouched. When the cows eat straw, they actually digest that stuff and get food and nutrients out of it, okay? And the reason why this is, I don't know if you've ever seen this picture before. This is a fistulated cow. This is actually a hole. You can actually take the plug out, poof, and put your hand into the cow's stomach, okay? And the cow doesn't mind at all. And the reason why people do this is that when you go in there, the microbes that are actually in the cow's stomach are actually degrading the straw and getting food out of it. So now you're going, wait a minute, we need to degrade straw. Maybe this can help us out. Right? Termites is another one, right? Termites eat wood all the time. They chew people's houses in California all the time. In the belly of the termites, there's a whole flora of microbes that actually break down the cellulose and digest it. All right, so now people start scratching their head going, wait a minute. We have all these different organisms. This is just pictures of microbes that actually do this, that you can get from the cow's stomach and the stomach of the termite. So people started going, well, maybe we start looking at these natural systems, and we can look at them to see how that can help us in our technology. The other thing that we have a lot of is yeast, right? It's an amazingly efficient, superb, great, every time I don't know if you guys drink beer at your age, but every time I drink beer, I think about this process where you can take yeast and sugar and turn it into alcohol, and you get these wonderful beverages. So the problem is that we have cellulose-degrading microorganisms that are very good at degrading the cellulose, right? So we have the one part we can degrade cellulose. We have these other organisms that can ferment glucose to ethanol or whatever else you want to do, but we don't have any organisms that can do both at the same time. And that's where the complexity of the system comes, right? The enzyme hydrolysis and the fermentation, the two different steps. So it's really, nature hasn't put those two together yet. So the idea would be, if you can do this, and this is what I had to pitch a little bit of the science that I do in my lab. This is one of the projects that we actually are working on into the lab is we're taking yeast strains that we know can use glucose and make ethanol fairly well. And then we're sequencing genomes of fungi, and we're finding all of the different enzymes that are degrading the wood, right? So you can find these wood-degrading enzymes in the fungi. And we're taking all of these enzymes, and we're moving them into yeast. So now what you have is you combine the two great steps that you need, the ability to degrade the wood and the ability to ferment the glucose to something valuable. So this is called metabolic engineering, okay? You can actually engineer the metabolism of these things, make them do something that they never used to be able to do. Okay? So this is slowly getting into the realm of, wow, we can actually start piecing new organisms. I wouldn't say this is a new organism, but we can actually start, we know enough about all these different organisms and how they operate that we can start piecing different parts together and combine some of the benefits of these organisms. So the last few things I want to show you is, and I've talked about this from the beginning, and don't worry, you don't have to read all this, but can we make something better than ethanol? Okay? So, and this is something that you've heard probably maybe a few times. It's made the news in the last couple of years. Is if you were to move all constraints, right, and you say, think about the best possible fuel out there. We know ethanol's not it. Think about the best possible fuel. And if you actually think about energy density and you know, the hygroscopy and corrosiveness and everything else, then the answer is petroleum or hydrocarbons, right? The fuel that we have today is really the best fuel you could ever think of. So now the next question is, well, can my bug, instead of making ethanol, make something else, right? So this gets a little farther out. So the process is simple. This is all the biochemical pathways that you can find in yeast. Normally the yeast will consume glucose, go through all this and spits out ethanol. Okay? fairly simple, right? So what I'm getting at here, what I'm getting at here is that there's all of these other types of molecules. Okay? So here's butanol, isopentanol. There's all of these different things that the organisms can actually make. I've circled this one here because the next slide is going to talk about that. But what we can actually do in these organisms, I thought my slides, I don't have anything in between. Oh. Okay. What we can actually do in these organisms, we know it comes back again to knowing all the parts and what they do and how they work together. We can actually go in there and start eliminating some of these genes, right? So the genes that make ethanol, we don't want it. Turn it off. But we want genes that are making more of these compounds, turn them on, or add them if they don't have it, right? So you can start piecing parts of metabolisms or organisms together, and all of a sudden you can actually start making a hydrocarbon. Okay? This has been done, and I'll tell you a story which is really fun and interesting. I think it's a 2-slide story. So you can see in the pathway here, you can start from glucose, and if you push it down this way, you can make these molecules called terpenes. Okay? Way back in my younger days of postdocing, I worked I actually started a biotech company called Amyris. And what Amyris really wanted to do is they wanted to make this molecule. So this molecule is used as an antimalarial compound, okay? And this molecule, it's called artemisinin, is only made by a plant. So what we actually wanted to do, and we were funded by the Bill Gates Foundation, and we were working with a whole bunch of other people, what we wanted to do is we wanted to take all of the genes from the plant and move them into microbes to make an antimalarial compound. Now you're going to say, where are you coming from, and where are you going with this story? Well, the story is, what we actually managed to do is we managed to take the same organisms that makes this molecule, and we kind of diverted the pathway a little bit, and that same molecule now does this, okay? So what you're actually looking at here is some of the little dots in here are yeast, and what the yeast is actually doing is floating in a puddle of oil. It's not ethanol, it's oil. So ethanol, you wouldn't be able to see it because it's mixed with the water. Oil floats on top of the water. If you've ever made vinaigrette, you know that, okay? So now we're going one step farther. We're thinking, let's not make ethanol. That's just dumb. Let's make something better. And through genetic engineering and some of these methods, you can actually make real petroleum oil out of microbes. So really what we're doing, and I hijacked this slide from somebody else. So this is leading to something else called synthetic biology. And the definition of synthetic biology is really broad, but synthetic biology is basically knowing enough about a biological system where you can engineer it in a synthetic way or make something synthetic. And where we're at and what I've talked to you about is very simple. Right now we can actually take the Empire State Building and build the Empire State Building on St. Patrick's Day, or we can take cream cheese and build cream cheese with scallion. Very simple things, right? So here's a really complex organism, and we can add 10, 20 genes to it. The things I described to you, for yeast, for example, has 13,000 genes, and we talked about putting 20 to 30 new genes in it. So we're a long ways from doing a new organism, but we started doing some of these things, okay? And we're learning as we're doing this. So there's a principle called learning by building. People that started building bridges initially, that's what they were doing. They would build a bridge, it'd collapse and go, not so good. They would build another one, it'd collapse and go, we can do better. And eventually they built something that didn't collapse. Engineers do this all the time. So biologists are at this point now, right? So we're building microorganisms and we're building living organisms. 99.9999% of the time it fails. Once in a while it works. Every time it works or fails, we learn something, okay? So we're learning by building. And really, if you think about this, and this is the slide that I always like to use to illustrate the idea, is that if you actually start thinking about a computer and the electronics, the high-tech industry, in the 60s and 70s, it started with something really simple like resistors and things like that. And then from there, we could actually build circuits and modules, and eventually computer and computer networks. Really, the beginning was here until we actually managed to harness the electron and be able to build some of these things. We weren't going anywhere. So if you think about a biological system, and there's a perfect analogy, right? In the biological system, you have a gene or a protein, which would be a simple component of the electronic system. You put your genes or your proteins together, you end up with biochemical reactions, so a little bit more complicated, a pathway or electronic circuits. So you put many of these things together, you end up with a biochemical pathway, which will be a module. You put many of these pathways together, you produce a cell. You put many cells together, you end up with a tissue. So there's an increasing level of complexity. And you can eventually reach there. We have, of course, developed this before we could develop that or this. But we eventually got there because we knew enough about the lower parts and the individual components. So I'm here to tell you that right now we're somewhere here. We're learning quite a bit about this, and we're a long ways from learning how this works, okay? But this is really where we're heading. And eventually, we're all going to be dead by then, but eventually, we're going to know enough about biological systems that we're going to be able to design a tree that when you throw a seed in the ground, it comes out and it builds a tree house. I mean, it's kind of far-fetched, but we should be able to get there eventually where we know enough about biological systems, we can control them, manipulate them, move them around, and they can actually become a benefit to you and I. It's kind of a scary proposition, but I think we're there. And what we're trying to do at Concordia, I just want to put this up, all this stuff I've been telling you about fuels and energy and ethanol and all of this, its activities are very, very high profile in Canada right now. So there's two different networks that are formed. One of them works mostly on agriculture. So Agriculture Canada has spent $20 million on this network for biofuels, and the National Science and Engineering Research Council spent $5 million on a network that looks more at the forestry residues and making fuels, and all of this is supported by these Genome Canada and Genome Quebec. So hopefully we're going to have some major breakthroughs in the next 10, 15, 20 years. If you want to know where we're at today, is the limiting factor today is we need to find someone to spend $400 million. Okay, that's really the limiting factor. And it's this learning by building, right? So the engineers will always tell you, you always need to build the first plant, the term they use is debug it. Because the first plant you use is going to be horrible. It's not going to make money, it's going to fall apart, it's going to have all sorts of engineering problems, and it's going to be a complete disaster. They know this, but they realize that you have to do this. So now you have to find a sucker out there who's going to spend $400 million to learn all of this. And this is really where the limitation is. In the US and Barack Obama, they're spending billions of dollars on this stuff, and they're actually building 4 demonstration plants. So demonstration plants are in between what we do in the lab and the full-scale, huge thing. So they're hoping to debug a lot of the engineering through demonstration plants. These plants cost somewhere around $100 million to do. So they're building 4 of those to try to learn enough about it. And hopefully in Canada we're going to wake up and do that soon, and we're going to have the technology come online by the time you guys are my age, I guess. And I'll be too old to drive. All right, and if you want to know more, I don't have an email address. I don't know if an email address can be circulated. You're more than welcome to email me and come and visit if you want. And that's it. It's actually a discipline that's, what's fun about this discipline is that we work a lot with everybody. We have chemists, we have engineers, we have cell biologists, we have computational scientists. A lot of the systems biology I was telling you about, the amount of information is so huge that a single human brain you can't figure that information out. So there's a huge component of bioinformatics and computational work that goes in there to be able to do all of this stuff to help us out. So I work with with a computational biologist from the University of Toronto, and he actually has built in a computer an in silico model of what a yeast cell looks like and what it does. And what I tell him is, I say, okay, I want to feed my yeast glucose, and I want this to come out. How do I increase the output of this, whatever it is? And he'll use his computer models and his software, and he'll come over and say, you need to eliminate these 10 genes and add these 5 genes in there, and it should work better. So then we go into the lab and we build all of this, and then we look to see if it works or not. And I tell him, well, it didn't kind of work so well, but it worked a little bit. And he'll say, what worked? And I go, well, this worked. And he'll put it in his computer model, and he'll punch it again and say, try doing this. And so there's a lot of interaction between computational people and molecular biologists and things like that to really help us and guide us in what we're doing. Yeah?
Do you work with the people in the States? Because they have the...
Yeah. We work a little bit with the people in the States. It's difficult to approach these people because they have, so the people I work with have $300 million budgets, and I have a $5 million budget, and they'll say, wow, you know, what can you do that I can't do with $300 million? So it's, but we interact, so 2 weekends ago I was in Ottawa meeting with the Brazilians. And the Brazilians have an interesting, we're actually building an interesting relationship with the Brazilians. They take cane sugar, so the sugar that you eat, right, refined sugar that you put on your cereals in the morning, it's from cane, right? When you extract the sugar from the cane, you end up with this huge stick. I wish I had a picture of this huge stick of cane sugar that's just useless. What they actually do is they burn it over there and they use it to make steam. Then they started thinking, well, instead of burning these sticks of it's called bagasse, the used cane sugar sticks, why don't we convert these sticks into ethanol, right? So we would have a plant that makes ethanol from cane sugar, and we'd take the residues from the cane and make ethanol from that too. And it makes a lot of sense because they have all the cars to drive on ethanol, they have all the distribution system, they have everything. They don't have the technology to convert the cellulosic stuff into ethanol. So yeah, we're engaging with other countries outside of Canada. The US are sometimes difficult to talk to. Yeah, well, they think they know it all, that they can do it all, right? Yeah?
Are there other countries that are interested in using biofuels?
Every country on this planet. I was at a meeting in the fall. So there's a big agency called the International Energy Agency, IEA. And pretty much every country that uses fuels on this planet is represented on the IEA. So there was a big international meeting on the Biofuels task force that was there. And I saw people from Croatia there. I saw people from Portugal. I saw people from South Africa. South Africa, who wants to develop biofuels. But it's really interesting because, you know, the first slide that he shows up is this prairie grass with lions and giraffes running in the background. And they're going, we have all this grass we can turn into fuel. So it's a completely different reality in terms of what they can do and where their resources are coming from. But they have the same problems we do. They need energy. They need fuel. Where are they going to get it? So, yeah.
Yeah, so you're creating genetically modified organisms, essentially bacteria and so on.
Right.
Kind of playing God a little bit, creating new forms of life.
Right.
I'm just wondering what kind of precautions are taken with whatever you're creating in the labs? Are these things kind of carried from lab to lab all over Canada and so on, or is that like top secret, not top secret, but like really?
Yeah, so at the lab level, there are certain procedures that we have to follow. So we can't take these things and just dump them down the drain. So the cultures that we use and all the fermentation that we do, we'll either kill it with bleach or we'll autoclave it, we'll sterilize it before we discard. We do exchange strains by mail, so I'll take some stuff that I have and I'll mail it to other places. When you do that, we always do it through a courier, FedEx or something like that, and they have very strict rules. You have to declare what you're sending over there, and they have specific ways they tell you how to ship. There's actually a course on how to ship biological material, and they tell you how to take your precaution. So there is some precautions taken there at the lab level. The more difficult thing is if we have something valuable and then industry wants to test it out. So believe it or not, the world's biggest producer of yeast is right down the street. It's called L'Allemand. They're on Préfontaine. There, they have bigger problems because they're really talking about scale up. They're really talking about large amounts. They're talking about doing this in facilities where they're actually making yeast for bread or beer in the same facility, so you don't want to cross-contaminate these things. So the regulations there are really, really tight compared to to what we would do in the lab. The issue, I mean, people always worry about you release these things in the environment. What it comes down to is it's a question of fitness. If I release my yeast in the environment, it's going to be dead in no time because it's not fit to live there. I mean, of course, we don't do that on purpose. But anyone that's ever tried to do environmental release of lab microorganisms realize that they die really quickly. It's just because they can't compete in the environment against bugs that are naturally out there. But we don't do it on purpose. Yeah.
Oh, basically, what you guys are doing is you want to make fuel from plants, right?
Right.
But fuel to get burned very fast.
Right.
The plants they grow very slow.
Right.
So that we don't have a balance.
Well, we kind of do, and people have modeled this. So you can actually determine, okay, I can make, for every ton of biomass, I can make 70,000 liters of ethanol or something like that. So we know what the output is. It's more like 7,000 liters. So once you know what the output of fuel is to the amount of biomass, then you can go back and calculate how much biomass you have available. And this was the problem with the corn ethanol. So it was really interesting. If the U.S. government wanted to get to something like 30% ethanol in the cars today, they would have to use 100% of the corn that they produce on all the corn-producing farms in the U.S. So in this case, you're biomass limited, you're right. What we're talking about here is going after a lot of waste material, right? And we're talking about huge surface areas. So if you start thinking about the prairies that grow wheat, once you collect the wheat grains from the plant, you have a huge amount of straw. And you'll go see the farmers in the prairie, and they say, we don't know what to do with the straw. We have so much of it. So, but that calculation's been done, and this is why it's problematic for some countries, because they're not biomass rich. This is why it's an advantage for Canada, because we have huge amounts of land, and we have huge amounts of biomass, both from the forestry and the agriculture side of things. So in Canada, we're okay, but you're right. I mean, countries like France are not pursuing fuel from biomass very actively because they don't have biomass there.
But in the end, won't you consume the fuel faster than you can produce it from the plant, from the biomass?
Well, so and it's all scale, right? You need to scale it.
So you need to produce more?
You need to produce more, and you need to produce it faster. And really, when you start thinking about these things, it's a completely different model from where you're living today, right? So today, you get the oil out of the oil sands, you put it in a pipe, and you distribute it. You can't do that with biomass. The future's, so if you actually take a bale of straw and you start moving it around, by the time you move that bale of straw more than 50 kilometers, you've already burnt too much energy moving that straw than you're going to get out of it, okay? So really the long-term model is you're going to take one of these biorefineries I talked to you about and you're going to drop it right in the middle of the prairies somewhere. And you're probably going to have 50 of them, fairly small scale. And the straw is not going to travel anywhere, and you're going to have to build a better distribution of your fuel. So it's a completely different problem, and it's a lot more problematic than moving petroleum around, for sure. And the scale is outrageous. And what you're thinking about is replacing all of today's fuel with a biofuel. That's never going to happen, okay? It's just too much there. But what needs to happen is we need to start driving alternative energy cars. So there's a certain dent there. We start driving less, right? And then start developing other types of energy sources that we can use. And then your need for liquid biofuels to move trucks and vans around is going to shrink significantly. That's reasonable to do. It's a combination of solutions. Everyone thinks about the silver bullet, right? That one solution. There's no such thing. Not going to happen. I wish it would, but it's not going to happen.
Thank you very much.
You're welcome.
Thank you.